don't think I've ever been called brave before for being a venture capitalist. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming this morning. I'd like to thank the weather for making you a literally captive audience. But thankfully, you're also going to have a very captivating panel. And this panel is on the future of pharmacology. It's kind of not very optimistically called, Will There Be Another Beautiful Cure? As we all know, pharmaceutical development is absolutely integral to the way that we deliver healthcare, whether it's new pandemics or ancient diseases, as we've heard, like cancer. But drug development hasn't really changed much over the last 40 years. It remains very slow, it remains incredibly expensive, and it's been dominated by just a few players. And so here today, we're going to discuss what the future of that process looks like. With that, I'd like to introduce the rest of the panel. First of all, please give them a warm welcome, and we'll get them up on stage. So going through these people's bios individually would take the rest of the time we have. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves very briefly before we kick off. Alex, what do you want to say?
Alex Zhavoronkov. I'm the founder and CEO of Insilico Medicine, a deep learning company focused on drug discovery and aging research.
Can you turn the mic up a little bit?
Yeah, something. The mic is not working.
I think we can hear Alex, right? No?
No? Oh, okay, now you can hear me. Hello, hello, hello? What?
Can't hear me. I'm hand up.
Yeah, just in case.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to introduce yourself again?
Please go ahead. So I'm Alex. Many of you probably know me. How many of you know Insilico Medicine? All right, great.
Okay, hi, my name is Bakshi. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called See the Signs. We use AI and big data to identify patients at risk of cancer at the earliest and most curable stage of the disease.
Hi, I'm Holbrook. I'm trying to discover medicines in a new way, working with smart machine learners and all the biomedical data we can get our hands on. And I work on drug programs for diseases like ALS, motor neuron disease, sarcopenia, muscle weakness with aging, and glioblastoma, brain tumors.
Cool. Is this working? Yeah. Hi, I'm Noor, CEO at GTN, where we build a quantum machine learning platform that allows us to understand biology better and to design small molecule drugs that are more selective, less potent, and more effective.
I'm Caulfield, and we've just met.
Thank you, everyone. So, to start off with a sort of a provocative question. Last month, Novartis announced the world's most expensive drug, a $2.1 million gene therapy. Is this the inevitable price of innovation, or is this rent-seeking from one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world? Alex, why don't you start?
So I don't want to criticize Novartis in any way. So what they are going after is a rare disease with that particular drug, and takes a lot of money to develop. They are pioneering the effort, and they should be rewarded for this pioneering effort. However, if you look at rent-seeking on drugs that have been on the market for a while already, and for some simpler drugs targeting much broader diseases, there, of course, you need to ensure that those big companies do not get rent-seeking capabilities. As a matter of fact, all of you should watch a movie called Dying to Survive out of China. So that movie transformed the way they actually do drug discovery and drug development in China because the generic prices were capped and people started focusing on developing innovative medicine. So right now, some of the smartest people I work with are in China. So they're going after me too, me better drugs, but now they're also innovating and going after really amazing targets. And this is actually one of the most beautiful things that can come out of this region because all of us will get cheaper care. So I think it should be done everywhere, specifically in the States. And AI can help a lot with that.
I think that to find the new miracle cures, we need new data and we need new analytics. We also need new business models. There probably aren't any blockbusters left. We're not going to find small molecule drugs that hit the known drug genome already that are going to treat everyone within a diagnostic group. We have to find new modalities. We have to personalise our therapies. And the old business model is not set up for that, so that has to evolve as well.
I agree with that. I think we need a new way of approaching this. And I think if the research is done here in the United Kingdom to generate that medicine, we should look at the simplest route to access to market, recovers a fair return on investment. It is, of course, the case that many drugs fail in development with the current system, and therefore quite often high returns are sought elsewhere to compensate for the many that don't make it to a cure.
And the hope is that we can use the data to reduce that failure in development, to create the economics by defining disease better, as you described. A lot of medicine discovery and development, it starts with the definition of disease, a group of symptoms, which isn't really fit to purpose, and Mark described this. This is a collection of symptoms, not the underlying cause of disease. And drug discovery and development works in these big diagnostic categories, which are not machine readable and not really precise enough. So if we can use this data, we can use genetics, we can use the multiomics and the environmental data to more precisely define disease in the first place. Not only will we have stratified therapies, but we'll also reduce the attrition rates, which is part of the reason the current economic model of drug discovery and development creates almost a lottery where if you do get a drug past all those hurdles, then you expect a huge return to pay for all the failures that have happened at the same time.
So you mentioned data there and how important that is to the future of pharmaceutical development. When you think about these very high costs to bring a drug to market, though, what are the other barriers that's stopping people entering into this market? Is it really just clean data?
I don't think it is just clean data. It's just also access to data in principle. Lots of clinical trial data are held by pharmaceutical companies, and it's very hard at the moment to get access to those data, like those endpoints that you would need to know about very early on in the drug discovery process. And without these data points, you can hope for as much improvement as possible in the early phases. But that also means that as kind of a new wave of innovative approaches coming into the market in terms of like use of AI and machine learning and data to access new novel ways of coming up with new drugs, you're kind of constrained with having to collaborate with pharma to get to those endpoints, and you can't really innovate by yourself to kind of to the greatest extent possible.
Actually, just to add to that, I think the most complex thing right now in AI for drug discovery is validation. So when you are validating something in imaging and autonomous driving, text, voice, you can validate with your own sensory organs. And of course, there will be a lot of outliers, but some rare cases where AI will fail. But when you're validating a molecular generator, for example, or a target identification system, it takes a very long time to perform experiments and to be able to see if your eye has worked or not. So you need to be surgically precise, molecularly precise, to perform the experiment and validate experimentally whatever you are doing in AI. And that takes a long time. And if you want to combine target ID, so biology and chemistry, the order of complexity goes up exponentially. And if you want to do clinical, that's even worse. So you actually are constrained by validation. So that's why you need to have a great validation partner and very quickly show that your technology works experimentally. Without the experiment, I think that whatever we're saying is not very credible.
I completely agree with that. I think most of my career I've been looking for a wet-dry cycle. We need better analytics to work on this data, but it's noisy data, there's lots of false positives we need to test. And the organizational structures that allow you to run the analytics, test what you find and go back and refine your hypotheses don't exist in many places. Benevolent, where I work, is great because we're actually running drug programs, so we're using this research in anger in our own programs. But still, there's lots of experiments take a long time, they're expensive. They're also not a proper mirror of the disease. We work in vitro systems which are often patient-derived. So you're asking, does my idea for a drug work in a cell culture, in a dish, maybe an organoid if you're lucky, but you're not really a whole system. So you're making those kind of extrapolations again by what I believe the disease to be, to what I think is the molecular target, and then what I think is a good test of that in the lab. And again, we do that in our heads. In our, as scientists, we have a mental map of it, and we make these extrapolating jumps. I wonder if there's better ways of doing that, if we can use the analytics, if we can use the biomedical knowledge that we have that's codified in the massive scientific literature to do that much more precisely. And I think we need those kind of solutions built up with access to all the data. A lot of it, I agree with Noor, is behind pharma firewalls to allow us to do that.
One way to do this, or to address this in part, is to collect lots of real-world data on patients and make it available. And then it matters a little bit less if the trial data stays behind firewall, because you've actually got the data and it's available from the health service. So what Matthew was talking about earlier in this room, for those who were here, and what Joe's just suggested and Noor's asking for, we can actually do this from data we routinely collect. It'll be real-world data, but actually probably quite a lot of what we do in the future in trials will rely on real-world data, because trials are becoming less and less affordable with conventional old-fashioned designs with thousands and thousands of people.
What would also be great is to collect biosamples.
Yes, agreed.
And I think some of the patient custodian centres, they're starting to do that. A lot of what we do is we test cells from patients, both disease and control, and look to see if you can look at that clinical heterogeneity up front. So rather than saying it works for this one person, there's one idea I have about mechanism, and then when I get to clinic, I'll see who responds and who doesn't. Can we actually work out right at the beginning of the drug discovery process who it's going to work for, who it's not, and go find those patients again when we get to clinic?
And we've mentioned validation a few times so far. So if you look at the FDA, although they did approve more drugs than ever before last year, they haven't really changed much over the last 20 years. And you could say the same about some of the UK regulators. To what extent do the regulators need to change in order to adopt these new types of pharmacological development processes? And so what do you think they should be doing differently in order for the UK in particular, and perhaps other systems globally, to encourage this kind of innovation?
Well, one thing I would suggest is they've begun to show some signs of change. So, for example, for the first time in the last year or so, they've licensed drugs in cancer that are for a molecular signature and not for a specific tumour. So if that signature was present in another tumour, and I can tell you in the 100,000 Genomes Project we see exactly that some people have signatures that should be in other tumour types. This may move our care from tumour type specific care to molecular signature care. And then if you add in other omics, has been suggested, you've got a very powerful way of stratifying therapy. And that means drugs may become agnostic to the tumour. They may be targeted to a molecular signature. So they've shown some signs of shift, but they will need to go further for sure.
Away from the default of an ICD-10 code to describe who you're trying to treat. And it's just habits of how we think.
Yeah, I agree.
And alongside the role of government, so what's the role of the patient in this? We talk a lot about epigenetic data. There's a huge, broad range of data set, the 100,000 Genome Project, clinical trials. What should patients be thinking and doing differently if they're going to be contributing to the pharmacological development process? And what should businesses and government be doing to make them aware of the data they have to donate almost in order for this to be successful?
I think patients are keen, in my experience. When something unfair has happened to you, you want to draw meaning out of that, either for maybe benefit yourself, but often just to benefit people in the future. So these patient custodian data sets, and I would kind of count Genomics England as patient custodian. People want to get their data together, they want it to be used. There's initiatives like Use My Data, Raremark, Clinical Data Exchange, who are pulling data sets together. We're working with an observational cohort in sarcopenia where we have both clinical longitudinal data, primary cells from biopsies of these patients' muscles, which we can grow in culture and phenotypically copy the patients. So cells from sarcopenic patients look very different from cells from healthy people in culture. And we have multi-omic profiling of those biopsies. Most of that has been public good funding, that's Research Council funding, that's link grants. People are keen to build these data sets now. I think that you see Genomics England, you see the million veterans, there's an understanding that these data sets need to be collected, and I think the appetite from patients for collecting data together that might help them or others in the future is quite pertinent. Probably we have to be careful that we look after the data and we treat it with respect, but all our interests align. Clinicians, drug discoverers and patients all want the same thing here.
I would say that I think this dynamic is actually being very driven by the consumer and by the patient. So we've never had a generation before so interested in being able to understand their own genome, understand their own personalised risk, and really shift towards the kind of generic holistic care. We offer them down to personalised medicine, and the expectation has followed through with that. And as such, we're seeing that the industry definitely within England has followed. We see very few patients actually opt out of data sharing when it comes to generic data sharing. And definitely the ambition is behind how we can improve and move towards transparency of the use of their data. So many patients are quite happy for data to be used even both in the kind of healthcare setting as well as within pharmacological companies and corporates, but to understand how it's being used and commercialized therefore. And I think the regulator aspect is really interesting, because how do we make companies accountable and corporations accountable when there's misuse of that data? And we've heard many stories definitely within the NHS and outside of the NHS where there's been misuse of data or data breaches, and there's been very little that's been done to hold these companies, organisations to account, and that sends a clear message back to the patients to maybe be more hesitant or create some more walls and barriers. So definitely from a regulatory perspective, we need to be more well aware about how we protect patients, but also I think a lot of this is being driven by consumers. I know personally many healthcare organisations and doctors on the ground are unsure of how to deal with all this demand being led by patients coming in saying, you know, I want my genome profiled, or I've had it done privately, here's my genetic data, you need to interpret this for me now, or take this, share this, do something with it, and we need to be better at knowing how to handle that information.
I agree with that, and I think that putting patients and the public at the heart of anything we do as a community can only be to the good of the ambitions of everybody in this room. We have a 35-strong participant panel, and they're throughout our organisation. They hold us to account, they help us set strategy, and they tell us when they don't like something, and they represent 97,000 others, so they feel an enormous pressure. But actually, we found them incredibly helpful. And I can tell you that if you are facing your child with a rare disease that could be life-shortening, or if you've just had a diagnosis of cancer, you're a lot less conservative about who you'll share your data with.
Picking up on that point, if you look at some of the historical... Picking up on that point, if you look at some of the historical studies of who commits data and who shares data, even in cases of rare disease, but certainly in cases of consumer genomic profiling, it tends towards higher levels of university education, higher levels of income, and it's very connected to often religion and ethnicity. Is that something that the panel's concerned about? And obviously, Mark, you already mentioned something that we're doing there, but sort of what things should be put in place, and what things are you putting in place today to make sure that data is representative of communities as a whole?
Okay, well, in the 100,000 Genomes project, we deliberately sought out communities that mightn't engage through the NHS, and we've achieved 17% ethnic minority engagement as opposed to 14% in the UK census. As people here in this room will know, in many studies, people from our minority communities, and the UK has a very rich diversity, have not necessarily always engaged or been engaged fully in studies. And they represent an incredibly important piece of information in the jigsaw of how to safely develop the next set of cures, because there are specific features in our ancestral genomes that may make certain medicines work better or work less well. And we need to be inclusive, and in the 5 million genome analysis, we will have a special section on that to make sure we reach those sectors of the community. The other reason why this nation must do this is it has an opportunity in some measure to be a research window on other communities around the world, from low and middle income countries where the infrastructure and the funding to do this is not there. So we have a duty to give this back to the rest of humanity, in my view.
Also scientifically, having this variation in our data collection is really important. We mentioned epigenomics earlier. I'm very interested in epigenomics. It's where the genetic and environmental interaction is first seen at molecular level, is first druggable. And some of the early findings from epigenomic epidemiology has shown that the strongest signals coming out are actually social economic class. So our epigenome is influenced by our genetics, and ethnicity is a large part of genetics. It's influenced by our environment. We can see effects of things like smoking on our epigenome and mediated by the effects of our genetics. But we can also see strong effects of social economic class, which we know in epidemiology predict a lot of healthcare outcomes. They're there in our epigenome. They're maybe inherited. That's more controversial. But can you imagine if we're actually hard coding in deprivation and privilege into our molecular levels? We should at least know, but that's something we can use as a tracker of how good our interventions are. If we are able to see the effects of suboptimal environments on our epigenome, we should also be able to see the effects of therapeutic interventions in our epigenome, so we should be able to track whether we're having an effect. So getting that proper range that's representative of population at the beginning is not only our ethical duty, it's also really important for us scientifically.
So what we try to do is replicate that in a real world setting. So most interesting, if you see any of you go to see your doctor now or tomorrow, you'll be treated as a generic. So whether you're Black African from South London, or you're from a affluent Northwest London community from a Jewish ancestry, you'll be treated with the same ideology of what your risk is for certain cancers and what your predisposition is. And what we actually know is that, a bit like what you said, that your genetic risk, your environmental risk, and your lifestyle risk will completely take you apart, where your risk of cancer can actually be 50 times higher of certain tumour types compared to your colleague, which is literally just, half an hour living away from you. So it's one of those things about how do we personalise that and take genetic data and precision medicine and big data to be able to say, actually, what is your personalised risk? And with genetic data, we know what the susceptibility is of that mutation within those genes based on what lifestyle behaviours you choose to adopt, also your environmental, your pollution levels in your area. So we can then make predictions and calculations to say, actually, if you smoke compared to that person smoking, your risk of lung cancer is X percentage higher due to your genetic mutations having a higher susceptibility. So that level of precision medicine, to be able to actually individually stratify and screen out certain individuals, is something that we're moving towards, especially in a country where we treat everyone as generic people, when we know that there's so much more we can do and offer, moving towards cures and prevention and early detection as well.
So obviously there's at least 4 people here who represent startup-ish companies, some very significant amounts of capital. But when you think about innovation in this space, there's obviously big pharma, but now there's also big tech. Apple and Google have made their interests in pharmacological development very clear. What is it that you think needs to change in order for startups to have a chance to innovate in this area? And where do you think innovation is really going to be driven from?
All about being multidisciplinary, right? We talked about this a lot. We need the biomedical understanding. We need the analytical power that's being developed in tech. And we need forums for those people to come together, and we need to make those decisions in a data-driven way. So I used to work in the pharmaceutical industry. In the pharmaceutical industry, the pharmacologist is king. Right? Drug programs move forward because of the experimental data. The Insilico data, and it's changing now, is nice to have. And if you look at how pharma is talking now, they've woken up to the benefit of data. Similarly, when you look at what big tech are bringing out, really great new algorithms and analytics, but are having to build up the expertise on the biomedical understanding to make sense of what they're seeing, interpret the results, and bring in almost as priors what we already know about mechanistic understanding. And so we have to find companies, academic spaces where experts from all these different fields can work together, and you always have to develop your own language to communicate with each other across these quite disparate disciplines.
Right, and the innovation is definitely not going to come from big pharma. Okay. So right now, many of the big pharma companies establish their own. AI divisions, AI groups. So everybody has a chief digital officer, a chief AI officer. But if you do talk to them, the first question is like, okay, how are you different from the other guy, right? So they don't take the time to read the literature or to go into the research papers or get deeper into the space. Typically, it's a repositioning effort from biostatistics or from basically the chief information officer became the chief AI officer. So they don't go deeply. And from the other perspective, the tech companies, they don't understand pharma very well. So they don't understand how hard it is to find a target and how hard it is to validate it and how hard it is to validate it with a small molecule. So I think the innovation is going to come from startups that have deep biological and chemical expertise at the same time. So it doesn't necessarily need to be kind of big pharma spin-off or big tech spin-off. It could be a combination of both. And I think that major innovation right now is brewing in China and Asian countries. So Taiwan, Singapore, Korea, and China itself, these guys are going hardcore right now. So in loosening regulations, and there are many, many, many companies like ours starting up in those regions. And I review approximately one research paper a day coming from really top journals, so as a reviewer, and some of the best papers come from Asia right now. Unfortunately, many of them don't have validation yet, but there will be a lot of innovation coming from that area.
I think as startups, we're like just driven by innovation by nature. That's why we establish startups, and that's what keeps us kind of going to work every day. I think there are three main ingredients for kind of flourishing innovation kind of ecosystem. It's access to capital, access to talent, and access to data. I think the more we improve on these three main aspects, the better the better science that's going to come out, the better medicines that are going to come out, and the better society. And I think UK in general does have like all of those aspects where we can always improve on this.
I realise we don't have much time left, just a couple of minutes. So in that time, and very briefly, it'd be great to hear from each member of the panel what is coming around the corner. What's the one piece of technology that they think is going to change over the next 5 to 10 years that's really going to revolutionise the future of drug development? If you'll start.
I think the combination of AI with multi-omics.
I think big data, machine learning, obviously, and kind of large-scale computing abilities.
I also think AI and multi-omics because we can start tracking the functional pathways of stuff we know that's important. At the moment, we're looking at correlates, but we're going to be able to get a mechanistic understanding of how our genetics and how our environment actually affects our health.
I think the most exciting thing is the shift of how we actually classify diseases, and we'll actually see the behaviour of diseases shift very much to what we're looking at now, to something completely different with the advent of the epigenetics and personalised and precision medicine.
So I think the link between biology and chemistry and clinical data is going to be key, and that's where major innovation is going to come from. So, by the way, wait till the end of this summer, you'll see a major paper showing that now you can tangibly prove that AI and chemistry can result in really amazing clinical results and late-stage preclinical results. So our group is going to publish a few of those papers. And I think that taking a small molecule discovered using AI for a target discovered using AI, validated in a patient, selected using AI, that's going to be fundamental for this for this industry to develop and for everybody to embrace it. So that's the next step.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. Look, very quickly, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists. Jack very kindly said VCs were brave. In reality, all we do is back people like this. So please give them all a warm thank you.